Welcome to the We Have a Spiritual Problem podcast, where we tackle the big questions. How do we cultivate a well-centered life in a world that often feels unbalanced? And what role does spirituality play in solving today's personal and collective problems? My guest is Chef Jeremy Rock-Smith, a culinary expert with a passion for longevity-focused cooking. With years of experience as the former executive chef at Kripalu Yoga Center and now leading the culinary scene at Miraval Resort, Chef Jeremy blends traditional expertise with innovative approaches rooted in Blue Zone and Ayurvedic principles. Food, cooking, and mealtime are often more than sustenance for Chef Jeremy. These are spiritual connections that have been lost in our modern society. Join us as we learn how to transform our pantry, reignite our culinary creativity, embrace the joy of healthy, seasonal, plant-based meals, and more importantly, reconnect spiritually and socially with food and cooking. Well, Chef Jeremy, it is great to have you back. We're on a different podcast. You were on my Aging Well podcast, episode 219, just very recently. But in that conversation, it became apparent that I needed to have you on this new podcast to talk about our connection or disconnection with food. So for the listeners or the viewers who have not yet listened or watched that episode, just kind of give a quick synopsis of who you are and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's great to be back. Great to see you. So my name is Jeremy Rock-Smith. I've been a chef for 30-something years. Started out with a traditional background, had a midlife cooking crisis, and went into wellness a little over 20 years ago. And I've been on that journey ever since. I was started in wellness at Canyon Ranch, where I was a teacher for 4.5 years teaching cooking. Then I was at Kripalu Yoga Center, largest yoga retreat center in North America, for 12 years, which I always say is like 144 in chef years. But I was there for about 12 years, and I was a food service director. I was the author of the Kripalu Kitchen Cookbook, was on Chopped, I think the first yoga dude on Chopped in 2019, and served on faculty for the Center for Mind, Mood, and Food. And basically, while there, in addition to being the executive chef, I kind of did all the teaching, and I act as the middle person between heady nutritionists and doctors and helping people make it applicable in their lives. And I stepped off about 2 years ago. Couldn't run. I had a staff of over 100 at one point, and I stepped off. Been on a funny journey. I went into wellness to kind of basically heal myself from the restaurant world, and now my focus is on longevity. And the time that I was off, I ended up. In 23, I ran an overnight kids culinary camp, and then from there it led me to a culinary trip in Greece, culinary sailing trip, which I think I said in the last episode, I was passed up a hill by a 95-year-old woman on Hydra, and I was like, all right, there's something to be said here. So I ended up meeting a chef online. I met her through her recipes while at sea, and I connected last year, and I spent about a month in Greece. I brought a group down for the olive harvest, and it's completely shifted my perspective even more so, about people's relationship with food, not just the nutritional aspect of it, but the culture, the family, the history, things like that, and the importance of it. So, yeah, so that's where I'm at, man. Longevity, teaching online, teaching over at Miraval Spa, and leading trips to Greece at this point.
So before we really kind of get into the food and spirituality aspect of it, would you describe your spiritual and philosophical perspective, and how has that shaped your worldview?
It's funny. I got to say, in my 20 years in wellness, it was a search for spiritual at the same time, because I had come out of being in kitchens where it's just the land of debauchery and hedonism. And, it's funny that you bring that up, because living here, when I was on that path, when I was going into the wellness, that's what I was looking to be, is just in a healing environment. And so Kripalu was one of those interesting things, because it's a yoga center. So there's many different modalities that come through there. And it's funny, in the time that I was there, just as I've used my body as a lab, playing with different types of foods and diets, I've also done the same with spirituality, in a lot of ways. Obviously, being there, access to yoga, meditation, connection to nature, things like that. So I was on a big search for that. Kind of give you a surprise background, which is interesting, is I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness until I was about 11 years old. And so I had a very interesting perspective on God and spirituality and what that is. And so it's funny, it's in a lot of ways, in the search for food and connection, I've been searching for spirituality at the same time, and kind of, I'd have to say, re-relationshiping myself with it. What is me, what is higher power, what is outside of that. So I kind of pull from all modalities. I remember listening to a speech when in seventh grade. It was on one of those old phonographs. Remember those ones that they would
Oh,
rerun, and
yeah.
they had shocks on them, like you could bounce them. And I forget who the speaker was, and I want to say it had to have been like a guru of some sort. It was just on that scratchy record, and he was talking about finding spirituality, finding God or higher power, whatever that is. And one of the things that he said, he goes, it's like all the paths that lead up a mountain. They take completely different routes, but ultimately they kind of all meet at the same place at the top. And so I've kind of taken from those kind of everything, really. I've gone from manifesting to just noting my thoughts. Meditation's a big part of what I do. Yoga was not, I believe you have to have that physical. So I'm very physically active, but I'm more of a sitter. I do a lot of meditation and stuff like
So, how is food healing and how is it spiritual?
that. So to me, food in healing and spiritual, there's many different ways from it. Fun. Obviously, we can look at it from the nutritional level, that it's just an extension of nature. And if you looked in, talking about Ayurveda, the sister science of yoga, one of the things they say is eating seasonally, eating locally. And that seasonal piece is the idea that the earth is giving you what you need in that moment, wherever you live. So I'm in the Northeast right now. It's been like sub-zero. What's the food that's around me? It's hardy root vegetables, grains, dairy, things like that. And if you look at it, what's it all do? It packs on insulation for the winter. By spring, I'm coming out. If you look at everything that grows here, it's all allium family. It helps you purge. So, get rid of the winter sludge. So to me, in a sense of like living through food that way, there's a connection to the earth. If you look at all modalities, I don't care, Christianity, Buddhism, things like that, they all talk about the importance of the connection to the earth and receiving that. So to me, that's part of spirituality. I think a big disconnect that we have right now is that we're not connected to nature. And food is one of those last things that, I always joke, like in any resort, the dining room is where everybody comes through. They could be there for chi running. They could be there for just, I want to lie around on the grass. They're all going to come through that dining room. And I think that's the one thing about food is, you look at food in two ways. One, it supports a spiritual practice, because if you're eating healthy, you're staying connected to the earth, which is all a part of it. You're naturally going to be vibrating at a higher level. So to me, there's that aspect of it. But then there's the aspect of the act of service. And if you look at any sort of religious or spiritual faith, there's this idea of serving others out of love. I forget who had said it. Maybe it's Krishnamurti. It wasn't Krishnamurti, but someone had said, the ultimate act of love is to cook for someone. And so I don't look at just the food as the actions around that food, whether it be, I don't know, you have a sick child and you slide that child the chicken noodle soup. That's an act of love. That's an act of service. So to me, yes, we're eating, we're staying connected to earth. That builds our spirit. But then there's also even just cooking for ourselves. A lot of times we don't view it as that way, as an act of love towards oneself, or metta, as they say. It's like, I don't know, metta is when you're sending good wishes to yourself and others. Food is the physical version of that in a lot of ways, in that what you're creating, you're sending good wishes to you, or you're sending good wishes to other. And you talk about it, even our thoughts vibrate. If you have negative thoughts, you start vibrating on a lower level. If you're eating really processed and disconnected foods from nature, ultimately I feel that for me, I feel that in my system. I start vibrating at a lower level. I don't have as much energy. Therefore, you can't serve, in a lot of ways. So that's, when I was at Kripalu, that was a big piece of the food, was setting up the fact of not just, it's not just what you eat, it's how you eat. And it's not just what you cook, it's how you cook. You know what I mean? And it's reframing cooking into that level of like, nope, this is an act of service, and viewing all things. That Thich Nhat Hanh said one of the best things ever in his mindfulness book was, when you're doing the dishes, do the dishes, And I always say that with cooking, it's the ultimate way to be in a space, be meditative, and be doing something positive at the same time for yourself and others.
So, how have we gotten disconnected from our food and our practices, and what is the harm in that?
Well, I think the disconnection for us is, rarely do we, as human beings in the modern world, have any part of the process of the food. And I think that's the bigger piece is, when I was teaching the kids culinary camp a couple of years ago, I had kids, 7 to 16. And bringing them to see the chickens and the eggs and seeing the food come out. You know what I mean? There's a big disconnect between where our food comes from and seeing it and taking part of it. And I'm not saying that you have to go out and be a farmer, but that's the bigger piece. Is like no one has that connection of where it's from. And if you look at our processed food, it is so far from its natural state in so many ways. And I feel like that's just a reflection of everything at that point. There's nothing in that food. It's whitewashed, it's pureed, it's mashed, a million things are put into it. And so there's really no connection to the earth anymore. And then you're just eating it and it's just kind of going in. Whereas you look at the cultures that really thrive, let's use, again, I'm always going to use Greece, but hortogreens, no matter where you go in Greece, they're growing pretty much year round, except for late summer. But part of their thing is people go out, mothers and women will go out and pick the greens together. And in that process, they're spending time in nature, they're spending time with each other. And at the end of the day, they're nourishing their families and things like that. So I feel like that's the bigger, the piece with it that we disconnect from.
It's funny, I live outside of Portland, right? And they have the show Portlandia. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
Oh, yeah.
And you just had me thinking about the episode where they go into the restaurant and they're asking about the chicken, what kind of chicken it is, and they ultimately end up going out to the farm to see how they're raised.
Right. Just like, no, what is their name? Yeah.
That might be taking that connection to the food just a little bit too far, but
right.
When you hear the phrase, we have a spiritual problem, what does that mean to you? And really, how does your role as a chef, as somebody who is kind of a much more holistic chef, teaching how to cook and connect to your food, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think, what you just said was the word connect. It's just about helping people rebuild connections to that. That's really what it is it's when I teach people. Well, here I give a case study as an example because I don't think this had happened when we spoke. So I had a weekend cooking program in September of 24, and I had a woman come into my class. I always share in the beginning what brings you here. What are you hoping to learn? That way I can make sure I check the boxes. So you want Dyson onion? We got that. And this one woman said, it was interesting. She said this. She goes, I'm afraid to cook. My mother, when I was a kid, would never let us in the kitchen. It was always her kitchen. It was get out. And every time I would cook, there was this kind of like pressure. And she's like, my wife isn't really healthy right now. And that's what it was. So we dealt the weekend together. And one of the things that I kind of, the pandemic, I learned this, like I used to teach people just recipes. And then I realized they're never going to have a sustainable practice unless they get their world set up first. So I usually send out this packet of like, you can't bring in the new, you got to get out the old, you clean out your spice cabinets. And it is in a lot of ways a cleansing experience because it's interesting because even though it's just like, I don't know, I always joke, the spice in the spice cabinet you've had for 20 years, you can walk by it every day, not use it, be like, that's too old. What am I going to do with it? And the day you go to throw it out, all of a sudden you have an emotional attachment to it, And so that's like old, so it's like clearing out. So I get sent all this stuff out and usually you'll hear, oh, thank you, da, 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 da. Well, 2 weeks ago, I did another weekend program. And this woman comes up to me, gives me a hug, and goes, hey, pal, I want to thank you so much. And I look over her shoulder, and I see the woman that was there 3 weeks, in September. And I said, no, it was the end of November. Yeah, it was the end of November. So it was quick, December, January. Like she had a month. She hands me a stack of photographs, which I didn't realize till later on. It totally freaked me out because no one's handing me photos, and I don't know how long. I thought she was handing me marketing materials so she could in class. I was like, what is this? And so I see the first picture and I kind of move through it. And the next one is the inside of a refrigerator and it's all neat and there's blue tape and everything's labeled with a date. And then the next picture is this platter of food. This woman shares with me that she goes, since I left, she goes, I did everything that you said. And this is what I'm doing. And what did she say? She said, we're now making enough food that we bring it and we deliver it to people. And it means so much because over the holidays, we delivered it and people were like, this is our Christmas dinner. She was like, my wife's lost 5 pounds. I've done this. I mean, she did everything that I ever said.
Wow.
Well, here's what got me. We were talking about longevity, blue zones, things like that, and about the idea of like living your latter part of your life. I met this woman who grew up on a racing track, and she said something really interesting to me. She goes, whenever it came to racing, it always comes down to the last leg of the race. It's the final sprint that really counts. And she goes, and that's the way I look at my life. It's that last little bit. And I'm like, all right. And so I was talking about that and just about the choice of, living a long life. And so she comes up to me afterwards and she says this, and she's like, I've been reading and writing you. I need you to hear this story. She goes, my wife and I had adopted three boys years ago, and two of our sons, 22 and 15, had taken their lives in the last 2 years. And she goes, and I got to be honest with you, you talking about this idea of living longer. She goes, I hadn't even thought about, like, would I want to live longer? Would I want to do this? And she goes, and I got to be honest with you. She goes, since you've given me this cooking, I see joy in it. I see that there is possibility for hope. I see that we can live a long life and have happiness. And just by me changing this one little thing can lead off into this whole other world of happiness. And she was like, you've changed, like, thank you. Like, I feel like it. And here I'm just like, here, this is how you organize your fridge. You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, for her, it was enough to take a little bit of control of what she could in her life, share it with others, and in the end, found hope in the end that, like, yeah, I do want to live a longer life. There is a chance at happiness. There is a chance at change. So, to me, it's like that small little thing had such a ripple effect on her. And honestly, it was the most proud I was of ever having taught someone in 20 years now of that. So I think that to me is where it's at, is we don't know what little thing we can change that can spill over into the rest of our lives and bring resolution, bring joy, or just a sense of peace. And so I think food can do that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I got to tell you, a few things happened since I last talked to you. One was that our 3-month-old refrigerator, the motherboard went out. So we were without a refrigerator for I think it was about 3 weeks before they actually fixed it. And before that, my wife cleaned out I got her your book for Christmas. And so she's done some of the recipes and she's been reading it. And she cleaned out the spice drawer and reorganized one of the shelves where we have all our spices. All that's reorganized now. But when we got the refrigerator fixed and everything was empty, my son was like, we have this empty slate that we can turn around and kind of do things correctly, and not get back into the habits of just cramming some of the food and overloading the refrigerator the way we would. And so it's kind of interesting that, even him, without listening to this podcast, without reading the book, seeing this empty refrigerator made the connection of it being a new slate, a new start, a new opportunity for us.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's funny. The refrigerator to me, it was over the pandemic. Because I had to have one replaced during the pandemic. It showed up 3 times with a dent down the door, and I had to send it back. And then I finally gave up on it. And then all of a sudden, it showed up 2 weeks later. I've kind of come to that. Don't push too hard. Just see what happens. But it's funny because for me, I got it in there, and I realized I had never really looked at the refrigerator. And even when you said that, it made me think of it. Like, dude, it's the hub of the home. It's just like the dining room at a resort. It's where all of your energy comes to do all the work that you do, And so if we looked at that, it's like the heart, of that kitchen. And so that's amazing your son noticed that. It's very cool.
Yeah. So do you see connections between spirituality or the lack thereof with issues like mental health, social isolation, polarization, those types of things we're seeing in our society?
I do. I think there's the one thing, spirituality at a certain point, yoga, meditation, and stuff like that. You've got the Sangha, you've got the community, but I feel like sometimes, you go to Insight Timer, it's great. That's what I use to meditate on. And, it's like, you've meditated with 50 million people this morning. And I'm like, I wonder what they're meditating on, and stuff like that. And I feel like a lot of us are on these individual journeys with trying to better ourselves, which we all are in a certain point. But I feel like sometimes we miss the point that, like, the goal of it all is, I don't care, whatever, is unity and community. You know what I mean? And so I find that people that, sometimes you can sit on your cushion, but you're not with anyone else. You can do your yoga in a room full of people, but you're not really connecting with anyone around you. And ultimately, they're saying that with addiction and everything else, that, a lot of this stuff, these mental effects, are just side effects of non-connection, non-isolated, not really connecting with people. And so, yeah, I think that's a bigger issue. And I think that's where the food comes in, because it can kind of bridge that gap of community. You know what I'm saying? When you're cooking together, eating a meal together, sharing that way, it gets you out of that headspace. It's great. You can work out everything in your mind, how it's supposed to be, but nothing comes into practice until you're in a community, at a certain point. And I think that's where food can kind of carry that over to the other edge, is let's get out of that. Food is sacred in so many ways, for God's sake, you look at every modality tells you to fast at a certain point. You know what I mean?
Right.
Everyone, like and we know now there's science to that it's good for brain, pre-diabetes, things like that. But yeah, I think a lot of times we get so hung, everyone's looking for that search, but we're so inside of ourselves that we lose the connection, and that's where everything, I feel like.
So how do we bring that connection back to our families, our communities, whatever circumstances we're in?
I think, for me, I think a meal, again, I'm not perfect by any means of this, but if you can, like, having meals together, I think is the key piece at a certain point. Even it doesn't have to be every day in a 3-hour process. It's just starting from where you're at and how you choose those meals to be at a certain point. It's very easy. I know myself, I get into meal conversations and they become venting sessions, rather than just sitting down and enjoying a conversation and hearing everyone's day. And I think that's the bigger piece of, like, all right, let's earmark a space, create it as like, this is the sacred space. I remember my grandmother always had that Sunday supper, you know what I mean? And that was the thing. We would all go over there and do that. So I think that's one way of doing that, over a meal. And then talking about all things spiritual over a meal, and that leads to understanding. It leads to shifts in perspective, things like that. Like I said, I think you said in the other podcast, we did a thing on food and film, and that was one way in every movie. Scarface, I don't care what it is, that's their way of getting everybody into a room to make a scene happen, to share the information. And I feel like that's the same way in life. A lot of our meals now are spent all over. We're on tablets and stuff like that, and then really not having a conversation.
I think that's an important thing at the table, is to just put those phones away. I hate going into restaurants and seeing, there'd be 4 people at the table and they're all staring at their phone and there's like no conversation going on. It's like, how is that healthy?
Right. Yeah, I'll tell you, when I was in Greece last year, I saw something interesting. Where I was staying on the farm, there was a team of archaeologists staying there. Katerina on the Odyssey, they let them stay there for free. They had found it's a shipwreck on the other side of Poros, 2,500 years old. And they were going down and pulling up stuff from this and giving it to the government museums. But anyway, I watched 2 of them, a man and a woman, in the morning. And I just read about it in this book. It was about Hydra, and this guy was talking about watching people sit together and how friendship is being able to sit in silence. And it's funny, I just read it the night before, whatever, and I'm doing some work at the table, and all the other archaeologists had left, and it was a man and a woman sitting there. Dude, they sat there 25 minutes together, didn't say a word. He would smoke a cigarette every once in a while, didn't say a word, just staring off, looking at the ocean, looking at this. And I thought that, like, how interesting, like, how often do you just sit with someone and take in the space and not make it something else, or try to make it something or guide it, or just being able to sit in that. And you realize, like, that's one of the things they say is that people that, when you're at a friendship level where you can sit in silence and not have to say anything, that's connection. And at that point, it blew my mind to watch it.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
But that's bit different, in my opinion, than sitting there with a phone, because it's like,
oh yeah,
your
exactly.
phone is out. You're not sitting there together. You're just sitting there at the same table.
Exactly.
You're present with your phone. Whereas if you're sitting at the table and you're in silence, but you're present for one another. I mean, if somebody would speak up at that table, they'd engage in that conversation.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the big things that we're missing in our society, is just that ability to connect without all the energy going into just either texting or emailing or calling or any of that kind of stuff. Nobody calls anymore.
Yeah, no.
So what kind of role do concepts like compassion, forgiveness, mindfulness, and those types of things kind of play a role in solving many of these spiritual problems that we have in our society, but also just how can coming together in food preparation or in meals or cleaning up after the meal afterwards, how do those all help to kind of solve what we are calling as spiritual problems?
Well, I think all of it, like when you were just naming them off, like compassion, inquiry, patience, all of that stuff comes through in cooking no matter what. Like, to me, it's like the ultimate. Like, I get people that, like, they'll screw up a recipe and they're just like beating themselves up for it, and I'm like, it's the ultimate opportunity for compassion. It's also I find amazing things happening. I don't know. remember one time we were making caramelized onions, 5 gallons, and we scorched the bottom of the pan. And I did one of those chef things where I just threw them to the side because I was like, now we got to do these over. And we went to do them over. And at the end of the day, we were cleaning up, and that pot got shoved in the back. And one of the cooks had taken out, and he went to stir it, to get the onions out for the dishwasher. And when he stirred them, he goes, "Chef, come here and look at this." And I looked, and they were perfectly caramelized. And I was like, "What? How did that happen?" And so then we actually used to take us 5 hours to caramelize onions. And then so then what we started doing, we'd sweat them down, get all the liquid, pop the lid, reduce it, and then we'd intentionally burn them. We'd intentionally burn them 3 times. We'd do it once, get a nice carm on the bottom, pull it off, put a lid on it, steam off. It would steam off the bottom. We'd stir it. All of a sudden, we could do caramelized onions in a half hour. And so, like, in that moment, like, there was frustration, there was anger, there was, what do we got to do? But in the end, we learned something that we never would. It's changed. I've taught that trick to so many people since then. So to me, like, that's how food happens. There's all these opportunities within food to learn something about yourself, to learn how to deal with frustration, how to deal with issues, how to deal with that. There's always a resolution, you know what I mean? And there's always that moment for laughter with stuff like that. So you watch in those moments with cooking. Look, you're prepping, there's satisfaction. There's an oxytocin. We know that there's chemical reactions. They're starting to prescribe cooking as therapy. Not the kind that I did for 16 years before wellness, but that's what you need therapy from. But using it as a therapy because they realize there's all these physiological reactions with it. You know what I mean? So like there's that sense of like you go to the store, you buy everything, you're connecting with food and the farmer's market. You get home, now you're organizing. And there's that feeling of seeing all the mise en place lined up and cut nicely. And oftentimes that's my favorite part of the cooking process, is to look at all of the stuff before it goes in, because it's like there's a sense of satisfaction in it. And then on top of that, if you're working with someone else to do it, now you're creating that sort of community, right? And then you're sitting down and eating it. And then you're having that conversation and stuff like that. And there's also the learning of it. I serve food all the time that people don't like. Like, there'll be that one person who's like, "Yeah, I'm not really fond of this." Oh, okay, that's fine. How do I deal with that? So that even within that little mode, there's all these opportunities to kind of better yourself spiritually. There's all these little challenges, but there's also all these little triumphs within it at the same time. I don't know if you start. I don't know. Sometimes we always look for these big, bold things in spirituality, that whack us on the head, and yet you have these things that are very there in front of you that give you those practical tests every day to kind of mold through them. I had a guy once ask me, and when he brought this up, he said, what's it like working in a profession where everything you create is destroyed immediately? And I was like, wow, if I had framed it that way, it wouldn't have lasted long. But it showed me the importance of how we frame everything. It's a practice. If you walk into it going, "This is going to suck, this isn't going to work," that's probably what's going to happen. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but you walk into it going, "All right, let's try this. Let's see what happens. Let's see what's going on." I could tell you, just like in the spiritual world, all those mistakes, all those burnt things, all the stuff that I was hiding from the chef, those were the biggest growth moments I could have ever had in my career. So I think that's the one thing we got to realize, that it's those little weird things that show up. Sometimes those things that frustrate us, that make it happen.
I'm sitting here thinking, as you're talking, that, what you're talking about, cooking, the kitchen, the mistakes, all those types of things, is the perfect representation of what it means to be spiritual. We tend to think of spirituality as a religious thing, and it's not. It's our existence with the universe and with one another, and what the mistakes are teaching us, and how okay, yeah, so you're going to create something and it's going to be destroyed within minutes after you've created it. But is it really? Because you look at it, that meal, that experience, changing somebody's demeanor. So they've eaten that meal, they've enjoyed themselves, they've had conversation. Yeah, they consume that meal, it gets digested, and then, what happens to it the next day. But reality is all that gets recycled too. I mean, that food that they consume is going to enter back into the environment somehow. But that experience with the food is leading to how they interact with one another going forward.
And I think it's short-sighted in a sense, because it's like what we do in the physical world. That gentleman, what he was looking at, his final product was the end point, was that dish on that plate. Once that fork went into it, it was gone. Whereas I don't see it that way. I see it as it's really not going to hit until they get it into their bodies. It's just like the sun, with chlorophyll, things like that. There's a transition that happens. It becomes alive. They talk about prana in Ayurveda. Everything's vibrational. That's why he was talking like why your mother's food is the best food. You taste the love in that food. I could tell when a chef isn't into what he's doing. You know what I mean? And so you don't realize that any of the energy that you're putting into the food, I do believe, transforms over into that person. In a sense, it's like when you're eating chlorophyll, you're eating sunlight, I mean, at a certain point. So all of your energy kind of transforms in that. And that's the alchemy, really. How you just said, you can shift a mood, you can shift a perspective. Someone could try something that's like, I hate that, but wow, that made it amazing. You just shifted my world on that one. That's huge. At a certain point, kids are the perfect example. When they try something that you make and normally they hate it and they like it, that's like the win beyond belief, dude,
Right.
And so there's satisfaction with that.
So listening to this, do you think that our disconnection with actually the making of the food, the origin of the food, and how we've become a society where we're highly processed, we're kind of buying convenience, all those types of things, that takes away from that spirituality that we're talking about, that we disconnect with our families by not investing that time in the meal preparation and the consumption of the food?
No, completely. The food like that is soulless at a certain point. That's what it feels like to me. There's no human interaction with a lot of that food. It's put through metal. It's through machines. It's not touched. That's like I've said. Look, you can have these fine dining restaurants that are tech perfect, but the food is soulless. Like, yeah, it's cool, tastes good, but you don't leave there feeling this. Being in Paris with the Moroccan guy that I would go get couscous from, he would wait your table, go back and make it and bring it back. And dude, this little $6 plate blew my mind at that point. And I think that's the bigger piece. Is it's funny. I was watching a thing last night. I guess it was it's one of our donut places that's changed, and they're bringing in more automation. And there's people protesting it. The workers, they were like, we're going to get taken off. But they were like, but their main thing wasn't even about losing the jobs. It was people want human connection. Like, how far can automated go? Like, yeah, you'll lose jobs and stuff like that. But in the end, what do we lose more so? Regardless, over the counter, when that person goes, how would you like that? Oh, I'd like that. That's where the real bonding happens at a certain point. So that's the one thing with all that manufactured food is you've taken out the human part of it. Someone once said to me, we would do this kitchery. It's kind of the chicken soup in Ayurveda. We did it 3 meals a day. And I had one of the volunteers eating it every meal. When you're eating it every meal, you can analyze. And she was there for 6 months. And one day she's like, it's too hard, it's too soft, it's too hard, it's too this, you shouldn't do this, you do that. Finally, I called her up one day. I said, what's going on with you in the kitchery? And she was leaving comments about it. And she goes, it's just different every day. It's different every day. And I noticed it. And I looked at her and I said, so you want it to be exactly the same every day? And she was like, yeah. I said, and I had never thought about it this way. And I looked at her, I said, oh. I said, that will never happen. And she goes, why? And so in all my career, I would always taught to consistency. You want to make everyone the same. But then I realized something as she was saying this, that consistency you'll never get. Where do you get that consistency? The fast food places that have taken the humans out of it. Anytime you have a human involved cooking, you and I can cook the exact same recipe, do it the exact same way. It's going to taste different because of the human. And so I said, that sort of consistency you want, you'll never get here because there's human beings involved. And I don't think I ever want it to be that consistent. I want the ballpark, but you have to leave room for that. And she kind of looked and she stopped complaining after that. It was good. But it really was like a thing for me because I was like, my whole life we would always talk consistency, but consistency to a point. Like, once you take human beings out and it's just this cookie cutter, that's where the food's like, And I think that's one of the things we talk about, kind of the mindfulness, how people are eating. People don't taste. People just kind of go, and they're doing that, and there's never really a connection of like, how does this really make me feel? That's the one thing that blows my mind is that people will eat, feel like crap all the time, and not even recognize it. That food's doing that. And so that's where, to me, the spirituality of just self-inquiry. You don't need to be meditating. First check in with, how do I feel after this meal? And I think that's the piece where food comes in to spirituality.
So you've done a lot of work in kind of the blue zones, the Mediterranean, with Greece and things like that. And we hear of, all the benefits, the people living in the blue zones, all the reasons why they live longer than everybody else. We hear the Mediterranean diet being kind of considered the healthiest diet. although I hear, the Nordic diet is starting to kind of cruise in there a
Yeah.
little bit as well. What is it about these that make them healthy? It's not just the food itself, is it?
No, not at all. I think that the biggest thing for those cultures is one, and this is where there's a disconnect for us. To me, spirituality is also deeply intersected to your connection to ancestors or history. And for us, and a lot of that comes through food. And, spending time in those areas, what I find is that I don't care if you're in the blue zone specifically of Icaria or just all over Greece, there's a deep connection to family, history, and tradition through the food. And I think that's the bigger piece is that it's not just this, put on a plate, da 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 da. We were when my friend Katerina was here, we were talking about the fasolata, the white bean soup, the Greek soup, basic soup. And I never knew this during World War II when they were in the middle of everyone was broke. There were rations, and the women, if she's saying I'm poor, so I couldn't pay to say thank you. So she goes to make fasolata soup was an easy, cheap soup to make that was nutrient dense. They would use it and gift it to soldiers and things like that were helping. That was their way of saying thanks. And so it's interesting. Like, we have a soup. Chicken noodles good. We know that it's when we get sick and stuff like that. But down to that one, she was like, "Oh, this reminds me of World War II when we would use it as a currency to say thanks." Boom. There's another cake that they eat. I forget the name of it, but it's basically whenever you lose something, you make the cake and you eat it. And it could be, a set of keys or love or whatever it is. And so to me, like, look at every recipe that I do with her, there's a story behind it. There's a lesson. There's a connection. Even down to they make this kind of grain salad for funerals, and it's eaten throughout the week. They mourn for like 6 months. There's all these different points, and with the story of it, it's just cracked wheat that's boiled, and then it's the liquid set aside. It's mixed with cranberries. I mean, it's a power bar. Not cranberries, but pomegranates. And the reason why they do it at the funerals. There's an Orthodox Christian aspect, but there's also mythology because they put pomegranates in it. And the idea behind the pomegranates is because Persephone went to the underworld and she had a pomegranate. Pomegranates, when they get hard, they can last 3 years. You can crack them open. The kernels are still good. Never knew that. But the reason
I
why they
know
put the
that.
pomegranates in it, because it's a sign of life. And so to me, I'm like listening to this, I'm like, there isn't a recipe that goes by that there's not some meaning to something. And so to me, like that's so heavy. Like I grew up an American kid in the 70s. I didn't learn from my grandmother how to cook. I didn't remember my grandmother hanging bags of pillowcases with wheat drying every spring. That's the stories that they have. And I think to me, that's where the spirituality it because of that connection, the lifestyle is also slower. It's much slower. It's not always about having. Those guys down there. We were joking how Americans in August. Like what I notice is, get to the end of the season, they'll just start taking price tags off of menus. That's when they don't have the item. But like she was talking about how they just live with what they have because that's it. And Katerina said, she goes, in August, it's the dry season. There's no more lettuce left. She goes, but yet, you always watch she goes, Greek waiters are just kings at like, yes, can I get the lettuce salad? And they're just like, we don't have that. And they're just very off the cuff. And they were like, because that's how they live. They're used to not having things all the time. You know what I mean? Whereas we're used to having things all the time. And it's just so funny. I was like, that's so I was like, I was wondering with what ease they will say, we don't have that on the menu. She goes, yeah, because culturally, there's no shame in that because it's just not growing. And I'm like, there's your connection to the earth. There's your level of just accepting things as they are and working with what you have rather than trying to change or ship it or let's make this so it can grow in August. Da, 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 da. No, there's a certain peace that comes with that, I feel like.
And I think that's a huge reason why in the United States we have access to more food than any other probably country in the world.
Huge.
And yet we are the least healthy, the most obese, and the most disconnected socially. And how do we fix that?
My thing is, to me, I don't know. I feel like I think it's on its way. There's definitely more of an awareness of it now. I think, but it's gonna have to. I think it starts with food. It starts with a meal. It starts with a recipe. But ultimately everything has to like shift at a certain point. We've created a culture now where we don't have time to sit. We don't have moments that we're connected. And I think that's the bigger piece is how do you shift that? I think it will start with food, just like we were saying before. The food is always the hub in a resort. The food can be the hub from where all change comes. And so you're seeing it right now where they're going after the big cereal companies being like, wait a minute, how come you'll put this dye in our food, but you won't put it in Europe? How come there's 70 pesticides banned over there that are still in use over here? And it's people starting to wake up to that, you know. And I think when people start waking up to that, then more informed choices have, you've seen it in the last 20 years. I remember when I first got into wellness, like I've always eaten organic, but the organic brand has grown. There's definitely more of a demand. For God's sake, I saw one of the big classic chocolate companies did their peanut butter cup organic. And I was like, like that's interesting. Like, because the market started to shift and there started to be more of a demand for it. And I think that's a better thing. The other thing I feel like, with food in general is there has to just be a reframe. It's, when you're talking about spirituality, one thing about spirituality practices, there's never an end. You know what I mean? Like you don't just meditate for a week and all right, cool, I'm in nirvana, we're good. We move on. It's an ongoing process. It's like in Christianity, it's sinning, not sinning. You're constantly doing it. You're constantly in this repair. And so it's like really just understanding that, like, it's just a blip on the screen. And at the end, it's always going to be something. There isn't an end result. So it's really that matter of being in a moment and how do you reframe a way that's obtainable, in a way that it's not too much. I think I told you the story with my kids where I was doing the dishes every night and I got mad and I was like, I realized, I was looking at it as cooking. I need to look at it as, as serving my children. And starting to see that little thought right there shifted it. 2 months later, I'm like, I got to reframe again. I'm bored. It's just like going to the gym. And I think that's for me, I never worked out until 20 years ago. I go on hikes. I'm going to get healthy. But I started when I was at Canyon Ranch. And I realized, have I been ultra healthy through that process? No. But it became a habit that always stuck. And so it's something that I do 3 to 5 times a week. I have to have that movement. And it's just become normal. Like if I'm not connected to my body, it doesn't feel right. Are there moments where I'm like, this sucks? Absolutely. Are there moments where I'm like, I don't want to do this? All the time. But usually those are the moments that when I just kind of get out there and do it, I end up having the greatest workout. And I feel it's the same way with food. You know what I mean? It's replenishing it. So I think that's the piece is people kind of like, again, we're assaulted with information that we have to make this 180 change. And I think it's really telling people, what can you change right now? What's obtainable? Those SMART goals, what's obtainable right now? Like, all right, let's just connect to cutting one meal together once a week. Just commit to that. And let's try that for, I don't know, 6 weeks. And let's see what happens. And just do it. You know what I mean? Don't try and be like, all right, we're going to clean out the whole fridge. We're going to overhaul that because in a week or two, you'll be burnt out and tired. A lot of the preparation stuff that we do when we want to make change is just a way of procrastinating on it, in a lot of ways. So for mine, it's just start from where you are, pick something that's obtainable. And, for God's sake, if you're like, I commit to steaming rice once a week, sweet, you got to practice. It's no different than the person who's doing sous vide, I guess, to each his own. And I think the more important part is in that, what's really unique about food is that you can make it your own. You know what I mean? And what I encourage with that, talking about connection is look at your ancestors. Where are you from? I had a woman a few weeks ago that was doing an olive oil tasting. We did 2 Italians and 1 Greek, right? One was from Tuscany, one was from Sicily. And this woman said that she was like, we saw, oh, what's your experience about? Oh, my mother was Sicilian. I grew up in Westchester. She cooked Sicilian meals my whole life. Amazing. Okay, cool. So I read them the description of these 3 olive oils. They have 3 cups in front of them. Then they have to taste and decide which one is which. It's a blind taste test. It was hilarious, man. The second one was the Sicilian one. She doesn't know this. She takes it, and I watch her face visibly just light up. Oh my God, that's the best one. That's my olive oil right there. Dude, she proceeded. She had never done a tasting. She got all 3 right. And then the irony of it was, I had to, because I couldn't tell her in that moment. I said, the one you like the most, guess where it's from? I said, your motherland. I was like, so I'm like, you can't tell me that there wasn't some sort of connection there. Either brought her back to being a kid or brought it back there. And so, dude, the look on her face, she was so excited. And in that moment, what happened? It made a connection to her roots, to her ancestors. You can see, it stabilized you in a way. So to me, look at where you're from. My grandmother's Polish. I remember her making kielbasa. There's little things that I remember here and there. My grandfather was Scottish. My mother still makes shortbread. Is it the world's healthiest shortbread? No, but I remember just snacking on tins of it as a kid. She actually, for the holidays, gave me a dish towel that has the recipe printed on it. So we have it. And that made me feel really good. I was like, sweet, that can stay in the family and get handed down. and that's
Yeah.
great grandmother's thing. So to me, is like, look at where you're from. Look at what childhood. Look at where you're. You're from Peru. Look up some Peruvian food. Don't just take food and be like, I want to get this meal on the plate. If you've got kids and you're going back to generations, hey, this is where your family. This is where your culture. You can build even more connection to your history, to each other, and you're discovering things in that process at the same time. And through that, memories come up. Like you start talking about different things, and so to me, that's where I would start.
Yeah, I think we've
What's your
lost that
goal?
connection with our ethnicity. I mean,
Yeah.
we both grew up on the East Coast, very ethnic areas. I mean, I grew up in Pittsburgh. I thought you were going to bring up pierogies there when you talked about your Polish mother or
Pierogies, yeah,
grandmother.
those are up there too. The
Yeah.
pierogies are there.
But I mean, I grew up the kind of bland white bread, Irish Scottish in a community of Greeks, Italians, and Polish. And it just, there's so much connection there with the families and the food and just, embracing one another's differences because we can enjoy them, and I think we've disconnected from that and we've siloed ourselves off to a point where we can't embrace the differences among us. We do, so many people are up in arms right now over the DEI changes in the government. And,
Right.
it's like, I see some good in that because maybe we'll get away from labeling people and start getting into how are we uniquely special and different.
That's important. I think it's this idea of putting everything into a box.
Mm-hmm.
Like we do want. Like I watch my younger kids do that. Everything's got to have a label. And an example is I was at Kripalu, and you look at the Kripalu Kitchen Cookbook. A lot of that food is from all over the world. We had so many different people there, and so someone right before I went on Child, they were like, "How would you describe your food?" And I'm like, "I'm so bad at self description." And nutritious, just without thinking, she goes, "You do globally inspired whole foods cuisine, veg forward." I'm like, all right, that makes sense. And I started looking at it, and that's one of the things I realized we did do that. We would go to Spain, we go to Africa, we travel all over. And what I learned through that, which was interesting, is when you said pierogi, it made me think, the more you look at food in this world, you realize everybody's doing the same thing, just a little different. It's like you got pierogies in Poland, you got raviolis in Greece.
Right.
Like you got dosas in India, you got crepes in Paris. And when you start breaking that down and realizing that, wow, like yours is more unique, yours is a little different. How do we fuse the two? Which I've done before, and like it's fun in a way because you realize through that food, we're way more connected, and that could have been by trade routes and spices, but inherently there were ways before all this. Some of this food was developed before all of that, and here they were in unique places developing similar things, just not knowing it. And so that tells me that there's a basic commonality. And then there's the foods that were like, how the hell can you eat that? And I can't, like, I'm not eating that. And that's the fun part. That's the fun part. I remember being in France. First, I was in a luxury hotel here, actually. The chef made me cook dinner. And he gave me beef tenderloins. So I was like, all right, cool, they're going to like this. And then he gave me corn on the cob. And during the meal, it was all French waiters and French chefs. And I was like 20. I was young. I was like, I'm all nervous. And I hear the French guys come up and they're like, blah, 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 blah. And none of them took the corn. And then I found out that French don't eat corn. They look at it as cow food. They don't eat it. Like they think it's like cow food. So the chef's over there laughing at me, going, yeah, that's why he had me make it. But there's something I learned in that moment of like, all right, now I know that. I'm not going to give that to my French friends whenever they come over and stuff like that, which is really crazy, So there's a cultural thing. I learned something in that moment, I had a guy, Colombian dude, who would not eat pasta. It tastes like worms, he would say. But whenever we cook turkey, the spine with the little butt tail on it, he's like, give me those. And I'm like, wait a minute. That's what he loved. But it's cool, So that's what I find with it. It's funny. Working in kitchens with other chefs. At one point I was working with a French guy from Spain, Japanese dude, a British dude. And it was just so interesting to see all our different takes on food, but we were all producing French, which was funny,
Right. So I think one of the commonalities that I see, as I talk a lot about the health benefits of like the Mediterranean and the Nordic diets, the things that are most common between them are locally sourced, seasonal, and community and the relational piece of the mealtime.
Yeah, they all have that, definitely.
And again, that's something I think we're missing in the U.S. that we need to get back. And I'm curious if, is painful as these tariffs are going to be that we're currently undergoing, how it might possibly get us to start looking at more regionalities, buying local, eating locally sourced foods. Because my son the other day, or yesterday, was concerned about being able to get his avocados. He's a big avocado fan.
Yeah.
And it's like, first of all, avocados probably shouldn't be consumed year round. Second of all, we do grow them in California.
Right.
So you might still be able to get them, but maybe you might have to shift to something else once in a while.
Well, it's funny you say that. It's like great wars bring about great peace. Peace brings about war, and I can kind of look at it that way. It's funny you say that about avocados because I'm going to relate it to fish. So what I've noticed in my career, I started in '84 was my first restaurant gig, and in that time in my career, I've seen this happen a few times. And I was unaware. There was a recession in the '80s, but I remember all of a sudden my boss coming out schooling us on this new fish, and it was monkfish and mahi mahi. And he's describing these. These are these new fish. Da, da, da. Okay, cool. Fast forward to 2008 economic downturn. I don't know if you remember that one. And I was at Canyon Ranch, and everybody was about omega-3s. Wild salmon was where it was at. Farm raised it good, but what was happening was people were just farming, going after that wild salmon, and it messes with the population. They start using different practices and stuff like that. Well, I'll never forget. All of a sudden, from corporate, we got Arctic char. And they were like, this is for people that don't like salmon, but it has the same health benefits. Now, Arctic char had always been around, right? But guess what happens? Whenever we have that little push economically, it puts chefs in a corner. You're not going to go out and buy the expensive fish because you can't mark it up. So what does it do? It makes you more creative. And you start buying, there's guys that do the garbage fish. They do this. That's what mahi was. It was a trash fish. It was a side catch, basically. And so I always joke that, like, what happens whenever we have, like, and I think the tariffs could do the same thing for avocados in a sense where we shouldn't be eating as much of these as we are. So avocados in the last 10 years, I remember it was one weekend, it went from $36 a case to $100 in a weekend. And everyone was like, oh, it's football season. I'm like, I don't think it's football season. And what it was just China had a bigger demand. There's just a bigger demand. Avocado oil is another thing, and it's messing with the environment. There's cartels getting in the process of cutting these things. So honestly, it might be nice for us to take a break from avocados for a while, because you know what it's going to do? It's going to give the culture the break. It's going to give the avocados the break to replenish. And that's what's always happened. Arctic char gave salmon a chance, is what it did. And it made us achieve balance. And I think that's where, it's funny, in Greece, it's predominantly Orthodox Christian. Funny thing is, they're in Lent like 180 days out of the year. Guess what that does? They have a ton of vegan recipes, and guess what it does? It stewards the environment because they're not consuming meat. You know what I mean? So I like the way you said that, those tariffs, because you have to look at it in that way. I really think avocados right now, avocado oil is not used. They're not making it from the byproduct. They're using avocados, and that's what's causing it too. So yeah, I'm with you on that. I think it's a good thing to have for a while.
Well, I'll have to play this clip for him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Keep people in that. Well, and that's a way of reframing it. It's like we get I recognize after being a month in Greece, on the island of Poros, it's just Greek food. And that's all you're eating every day. I fed Indian food to some of the staff there, and some of them never had it. They were like, what? Like, it was blowing their mind. But then I realized for us, that's like, it's a great privilege to have, but it's also our downside, because when I look at a big menu, I can't make a decision. And that's the way I feel like food in this culture sometimes. You go on the market, you've got so much at your disposal that you don't even know where to start. You go into small little farmers markets locally, you know where to start. It takes the decision fatigue out of it, You look at the Greeks, that's why they have 20 recipes for eggplant that taste different,
It's kind of like us with zucchini in the summertime, right?
Exactly. That's the one thing we all have in common. Zucchini, that'll make you connected to the earth. Really.
There you go. That'll make you wish you weren't connected.
I saw a great meme last August, and it was a public warning this time of year. Park your cars, make sure you lock your doors, otherwise someone's going to leave zucchini in it.
Yeah. So as we begin to kind of wrap this up, how can we get people to begin to foster a sense of purpose or connection with food, or just in general, even if they don't identify with a specific faith or belief system?
I would say, to me, it's take an assessment of where you're at, first. And like I said, I think I talked about this before. Like, what's your philosophy? Really think about it. What are your goals? You have to set a goal. You just don't go and start cooking. And it could be someone that's like, hey, medically, I have to eat this now. There's your goal. It's kind of laid out. Or my child needs to have this. Or I just want us all to be eating more vegetarian. Whatever. Start from where you're at and just come up with a plan for it. But don't try and bring in everything new. Try and clear some space first, then bring everything in. And start simply. And I think that's the one thing about these food-based cultures. When we look at a lot of the blue zone or longevity cooking, stuff like that, because they were using what they had, they're very simple recipes. In other words, they're not 50 ingredients, but they're nutrient dense. And they're not using foams and sous vide. They're very just practical, easy tips. So to me, that's a great foundational place to start from. Cooking to sustain. You're not here to entertain. You know what I mean? Start simply and then just build from there, and like I say, start a meal a week and then go on. And I always recommend discovery. If you can do it in community, if you can do it online, my online classes that we do, we're in Sardinia right now. And we made a few weeks ago, we made one of their minestrones, which literally it's put it all into a pot. And I'm like, this isn't going to work. And it always does. But we did the Sardinian flatbreads, which are really paper thin. And I'm like, oh, we're going to do this online. And it was funny. We got online and there's always 4 or 5 people clicking along. This one woman, she's like, this dough's killing me. I'm like, you could have used a mixer. And she was dying, And, but you have to roll this stuff out paper thin. We don't have a wood fire. So I'm like, let's see if this could work. Really, it's a gamble. And so we're all doing it together. Dude, people were nailing them. The one woman that was struggling at the end, she's holding up this big sheet tray size flatbread and stuff. And at the end, everyone's laughing and it's a good thing. And I think that to me right there is, when we're in those groups, people that are shy don't have to be on camera, so they're watching other mistakes, they're learning. I'm grateful for them to share that vulnerability. But what it does is it makes people feel like it's part of a community and you're all on that same goal. I have a woman that just joined our group and that's what she said. I'm so grateful to have found this clan. She was like, because one, it's hilarious, but I just love that everyone's in that same zone better. And we all share with what's going on. And we see the mistakes in real time, and then we share it with you afterwards. Yeah, no, it's really good. And then she's actually coming to Greece with me in November to go deeper. And so to me, that's my thing is if you could start at home, maybe if you're having a hard time starting at home, go online. My stuff at jeremyrocksmith.com. You can go. That way you're not alone. Because sometimes you may be alone, living alone. No one wants. You may not want to cook alone. A group cooking class online. That's the one thing out of the pen because you're learning in your house, and even if you're shy, you don't have to. And then for me, after that is if you're in your local community and there's cooking classes available, do it. It's a great way to make community connections over and share things, and then you're part of something new. And then, from there, go on. Do retreats. Culinary travels become a really big thing. That's my goal. Bringing people down to Greece is you're never going to live that lifestyle fully because it's very counter to what we do here. But if people can get a taste of it, experience it for a week, that slowing down, that intentionality where you're not swarmed around tourists and you're truly in that environment, a seed's planted and you can take it home. And it's funny, my group that went last year, they're all on the WhatsApp and they're all still sharing recipes and making things. And, I made this from this book and I made this. And so a community was formed all through food, really. So, yeah, start where you're at. Start with a class. Start online. Start where some place reasonable. Don't try and go for the.
And so you shared your web page.
Yeah.
So that's one way that they can connect with you. Where can they find the book?
You can get that on my webpage. It's also on Amazon. It's also at kripalu.org on their sheet as well, which is nice to purchase from there because it supports the nonprofit. And then I'm also on Instagram at Jeremy Rock Smith and on Facebook at Chef J Rock. So yeah, I'm around. All right. Always around.
So I always try and end this podcast, unlike the Aging Well podcast where I have my little tagline, keep aging well. I try and end with some profound words from my guest because it's always ends with something that I can't top that. We're done. So I'm putting the pressure on you now. For the listeners and the viewers who are struggling with their own sense of purpose or meaning, what is one step that they can take to start addressing that?
One, struggling for purpose or meaning. I think inventory. I think if a lot of times when we're struggling for purpose and meaning, I know when I do, I tend to feel it's coming from a place of lack and not feeling like I have enough. And I think sometimes just taking an inventory daily or whatever of just, writing down what you're grateful for, and seeing things through that. And I think that's the place to start. Because if you can't find the things that you're grateful for, it's hard to, and also just kind of in that point of, it's no longer, I have to cook a meal. I get to, and just seeing the words that you use around things that you do. It's not have, it's you get to a certain point. My buddies and I were doing a challenge last year. It was 6 days a week. You had to do 200 push-ups, pull-ups, squats for a year, and we did it. And that was one of the things we came across was like when you were doing it, I'm like, there's so many people that don't have the ability we're doing that the days that you didn't feel like you were doing it was like, at least get up out of respect for those, you know what I mean? And so you have that, if you have that opportunity to take part, there's a lot of people that don't. So, being that real with it, with you having that ability, like that woman I was talking about, she discovered that ability and started sharing it with the people that couldn't, so I think that's a good place to start.
All right. And we'll just end there. And I just, again, thank you. And just keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Jeff.
And,
appreciate you too.
Take care of yourself and keep taking care of others too.
Thanks a lot, bud. Thanks for having me.